The Horde, released for the Sega Saturn in 1995, is an oddball entry in the city-building/god game genre. It tries to subvert the power fantasy offered by its contemporaries, while, at the same time, its core mechanics act as both a critique of and reinforcement for feudal and capitalist social structures. This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. First, a couple of quick points of clarification. For one, trying to pinpoint the North American release of the game is kind of difficult. Wikipedia puts the North American release date as 1997, and the Strong Museum of Play and Moby Games both have it as 1995. But most of the reviews are from 1996 or later. So, for now, we're just gonna go with the Strong Museum of Play and Moby Games consensus of 1995. The other thing we need to address right out of the gate is that, yes, the Sega Saturn version of the game is a port. Specifically, it is a port of the 1994 3DO game. We're looking at this version for two reasons. One, the Sega Saturn version of the game is what we have access to and can record gameplay footage from. Thanks, Level Hike! 2, the Saturn game is interesting for just who brought it over to the Saturn. The game was initially developed for the 3DO by Toys for Bob, who modern gamers should recognize from their work with Skylanders, Crash Bandicoot, and Spyro. The Horde was then adapted for the Saturn by Silicon Knights, who you might know from Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, the GameCube Metal Gear Solid remake, Eternal Darkness, and being driven out of business for trying to steal the Unreal Engine from Epic Games for both 2 Human and X-Men Destiny. So, yeah. The Horde offers a whimsical setup to get the player into the action. Good King Winthrop of... well, it's never actually specified what he's the king of, other than a faraway land, is it? Wikipedia calls the land Franz Powanki, but I can't find any additional evidence to support that. Anyway, Winthrop starts to choke during a royal feast while listening to a ribald story from his High Chancellor, Cronus Maelor. Maelor sees this and hopes that the king's death is his gateway to power. Chauncey, a meek serving boy raised by a herd of wild cows, this is actually important to the discussion, we'll come back to it soon, comes to the king's rescue and is rewarded with the title of nobility and vast tracts of land. Vast tracts of land which he needs to defend from the menace of the ravenous, all-consuming monsters dubbed the Horde. Cue the actual start of the game. Maybe the parallel between the king's near demise due to voracious consumption and the Horde's voracious behavior was intentional. Or maybe it was just a way to have the king spit gunk onto Cronus Maelor's face. Speaking of making a mess of things, there's also the casting. Well, maybe just one casting choice. Michael Gregory, Cronus Maelor, Michael McCarty, King Winthrop, and Henry Crowell Jr., the newscaster, all seem fine as far as I can tell, aside from Crowell Jr. seemingly not acting again after the Horde for some reason. The choice for the role of Chauncey, the main character, is uncomfortable and yet oddly appropriate as the actor came to the part with a mindset from the Middle Ages. In an amusingly ironic bit of casting, Chauncey is played by everybody's favorite science-denying homophobic born-again evangelist, Kirk Cameron. The thing is, Cameron apparently wasn't even close to the first choice for Chauncey, and that's kind of obvious from the in-game character sprite, which looks and sounds nothing like him. According to Moby Games, the developers originally wanted either Jim Carrey, remember this was just pre-Ace Ventura and The Mask, or Michael Richards at the height of his Seinfeld fame. They couldn't get either of their first choices. Carrey because Ace Ventura came out during negotiations and he skyrocketed out of their price range, and Richards because, well, see the whole height of his Seinfeld fame thing. So they went with Cameron, who was settling into his whole science is a tool of the devil thing. In retrospect, all these casting choices are cringy. The choices were between an anti-vaxxer, a racist, and someone who combined those into one fun D-list celebrity package. Awkward. Credit where credit is due though, the FMV cutscenes are not nearly as bad as most of the era. While they are cheesy, they're intentionally so, and the performances are surprisingly decent. The writing is also surprisingly decent and gives a parodic or satirical feel to the proceedings. The cutscenes come across like the sort of thing you'd see on a mid-90s Sam Raimi show like Xena or Jack of All Trades, an aesthetic that carries over to the gameplay. The music that plays in the various levels is appropriately whimsical. The swamp music in particular is amusing with its, swamp gas sound effects. The knights and archers you can hire to help protect the village make cute comments when actually placed on the field.
None shall pass. None shall pass.
Also, the archers sound remarkably close to a certain mushroom-loving plumber.
You can count on me. You can count on me.
The voice actor is not Charles Martinet, though. Chauncey's attacks when fighting the Horde are as comical as they are effective. We'll get to that in just a moment. The random news breaks are a cute way to throw a new random variable into the gameplay.
Search parties have been deployed looking for the kingdom's tax collectors, who have been missing since the beginning of tax season. The king has decreed that if they are not found soon, there will be no taxes this year. The royal tax collector could not comment as he was all tied up.
And I'm pretty sure the Hordeling juggernauts reference Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 when they eat a villager or cow. All of this combines to give the game a charm that more self-serious games, like ActRaiser, are lacking. Speaking of ActRaiser, the Horde has a very similar structure in that it alternates between a community-building sim and combat sections, and offers levels in the form of new territories in which to establish communities. There are a few key differences which set the Horde apart, however. First, Chauncey does not start out clearing monsters from the areas in which he's establishing communities. Instead, he and the player are dropped in the middle of the community building sequences without any foreknowledge of the types or numbers of Hordelings in the area. Because of this, there is an urgency to the building segments of the game. The player both needs to encourage community growth and prepare for the coming onslaught of the Horde as quickly and economically as possible. Second, while the player is clearly assuming the role of a thinly veiled god or deity in ActRaiser, they are much more pathetic in the Horde. Chauncey is not some male power fantasy figure, even if he is a male wish fulfillment figure. Chauncey can barely lift Grimthwacker, his sword, let alone swing it, which is something that actually heavily impacts the gameplay. Chauncey has to physically spin in order to swing the sword, and doing so too often makes him dizzy and immobile for a brief period, making him a ripe target for Hordeling attack. You'd think that over the course of the game, Chauncey would strengthen up enough to be able to use the sword properly, considering how much he does swing it, but nope, he's dragging it at the beginning and he's dragging it at the end. As mentioned before, another way Chauncey subverts the typical male power fantasy in similar games is because he is not operating by himself either. Rather than venturing alone into the lair of the beast, so to speak, he and the player can hire stationary mace-wielding knights and long-range archers to help him protect the communities under his care. These additional guards come with a quarterly cost, but will actively target any Hordelings within reach. In other words, Chauncey is actually a member of the communities he is creating, establishing jobs, actively moving through the villages he is protecting, coming to the aid of individual villagers and cows when under attack from Hordelings, rather than standing above and apart from it. And yet, let's look at that notion a little closer. For one thing, while Chauncey is supposed to be a so-called everyman, he doesn't actually interact with the other community members. Aside from placing knights and archers, or rescuing villagers from the Horde when they are eaten, or not depending on how quickly the player responds to the threat, there is literally no way for the player to engage, encourage, or communicate with the people who make up the settlements under his purview. He can't even help determine which crops will be grown or where. All of that is quite literally out of the player's hands. Instead, these villagers are simply treated as assets and resources. The game reduces them to a set of statistics, which equate to either financial gain or loss for Chauncey and the player, nothing more. They are not given individual perks or even sprites. They are the homogeneous automatons Alexander Galloway discusses in his book on video games. In fact, the game takes it a step further, in a way I'm not sure the developers realized or intended. So, the player is unable to interact with the members of the community. Okay, fine, we just established that. The player can't even control where or how many crops those community members grow. Kind of awkward because that directly influences each quarter's fiscal earnings, but okay, I guess. The main resource Chauncey can control, however, is livestock, as in cows. Now, at first glance, this doesn't seem like an issue. After all, the communities Chauncey is overseeing are agrarian farming societies in a medieval European mold. Livestock is to be expected, right? Okay, sure, but let's return to the opening cutscene. Chauncey tells King Winthrop that he was raised by a kind herd of wild cows.
And where do you hail from?
Well, I have no home, sire. I was raised by a kind herd of wild cows.
something reiterated in the instruction manual, complete with a picture of Chauncey with one of his family. Despite this, cows are the most valuable farming resource in the game, and Chauncey seems to have zero problem with, I don't know, do we want to call them extended relatives? Anyway, he seems to have no problem with them being exploited this way or being put in harm's way in the form of horde attacks. Again, what should have been an emotional connection leading to a greater sense of community building is just turned into a set of statistics equating to either financial gain or loss for the player. The thing about this exploitation and reduction to a set of statistics is that Chauncey and the player are not immune to it either. Each year, Chauncey needs to pay a set amount to Cronus Mailer under the guise of taxes, an amount that can mean game over if the player does not have the funds to meet that payment. As well, the game has several events which are inserted randomly, many of which require the player to pay additional unexpected fees. All of this means that Chauncey, and therefore the player, is reduced to a set of numbers for the benefit of the ruling class above him. Okay, so considering the whimsical medieval storybook trappings, it would be understandable if this were just read as a critique of feudal society. Not exactly a hot take there though. Also, not exactly a correct one either. In trying to be whimsical and relatable to hip modern 90s audiences, there are several anachronisms which make the critique hit a little closer to home. One of the unexpected expenses that can crop up for the player is Chauncey paying for Cronus Mailer's performance bonus from the king, because Mailer found Chauncey's ATM card in his laundry.
Me? When I told him you offered to pay for it, he was delighted. Are you surprised? Well, you shouldn't be. Next time you send your pants to the laundry, I suggest you take out your ATM card first.
And we're just going to set aside the question of exactly why Mailer was going through Chauncey's pants. Those archers and knights mentioned earlier, they can be removed from your communities because their unions have gone on strike due to a labor dispute.
Labor advisors were unable to reach an agreement with the Archers Guild. All archers are now on strike and are unavailable anywhere in the kingdom. The guild's main demands are fewer hours, more quivers, and cheaper life insurance payments.
All of the weapons over and above your base sword carry not one, but two costs. First, you need to pay for the privilege of being able to have access to the weapons and abilities whatsoever. Second, each item is pay per use. In other words, the society the characters inhabit has more in common with a modern Western capitalist one than an actual feudal agrarian one. Okay, to be fair, imposing a pay-per-use method on the weapons and items in the game is a way to keep them from being abused. Fine, I get it. It's the fact that it's currency-based, rather than, say, strength-based or mana points-based, that makes it relevant here. On that note, it's interesting that the game deals with the issue of overconsumption in relation to the pseudo-capitalist structure. Let's go back to the cows again. If the player places too many cows too close together and leaves them for long enough, the fertile land that the cows are placed on will eventually become bare rot, unusable for crops, building, or supporting the cows properly. In other words, the game literally takes the tragedy of the commons, look it up, and makes it a game mechanic. The game reinforces this idea with the Horde themselves. The Horde mindlessly consume everything, including cows, crops, houses, and people, both peasants and hired knights and archers. Even the more intelligent members of the Horde, such as the shamans who bewitch the knights and archers, turning them against Chauncey, do so in service of, well, consuming voraciously. They are as much a consumerist allegory as the zombies in Dawn of the Dead, or more specifically, the fast-moving zombies from the 2002 remake of Dawn of the Dead. Not everything is self-aware, however. Looking at the swamp, desert, and tundra levels, expanding your settlements is not as simple as just letting people come to your village and start farming. First, you need to give them arable land in order to do so, a process which involves transforming the bog, sand dune, and permafrost portions of the respective maps. This might seem innocuous and common sense at first. Of course, you'd need to change conditions in order to be able to grow more crops. This gameplay system becomes significantly more troubling if you consider it from an ecological perspective, however. The player is coming in, destroying the natural habitat for the animals and plants that live there in favor of more crops and therefore more profits, and the game is rewarding the player for these actions. Returning to Galloway, the game teaches the player how to succeed at the game, and the ways it offers for doing so can carry potential real-world consequences. So the game definitely has some mixed messages in its overall gameplay systems, but what about the game's controls? Well, the controls are, let's be generous and call them awkward. A lot of the problems with the controls come from the perspective chosen for the close-up map. Taking a grid-style map and placing it on an isometric perspective without giving the player the ability to turn the map, a la Final Fantasy Tactics, makes accurate placement and removal of items difficult at times. This can especially be a problem in areas like the woodlands, where accidentally removing trees inflicts damage on Chauncey. The perspective can also be an issue while fighting the Horde as well. Trying to maneuver Chauncey to where he needs to be can be difficult because he can get caught on the edges of grid spaces without the player being able to see exactly why. Getting snagged on the scenery can also be a problem in relation to the archers defending the village. The archers will fire on any hordelings that come into view, which is great. What is not great is that friendly fire is definitely a thing. If the player is rushing Chauncey towards a large group of hordelings that the archer is also firing at, Chauncey runs a very real risk of taking damage along with the hordelings. This is something the Horde can and will take advantage of, particularly the Horde shamans who will bewitch the archers and have them fire only at Chauncey. Oh, and Chauncey doesn't have a shield of any kind, so he cannot defend himself, even after the Horde shaman has been destroyed. It's not all doom and gloom, however. Those same archers are still highly effective against most of the other forms the Horde takes. As well, that sword swing of Chauncey's has the same range as Link's 360-degree swing from A Link to the Past, making it surprisingly effective against groups of hordelings rushing at or past him. Also, in another fun, quirky aspect of the game, while hordelings can appear in the middle of the village during the combat phase, that can also actually be prevented, if you're cautious enough. During the building phase, if the player is eagle-eyed, they will notice a hole in their village, which a hordeling head may pop out of. If the player, say, plants a tree or shovels the hole, the Horde's sneak attack is effectively blocked. Oh, one final thing. Also, spoiler alert. Remember how I said that Chauncey was a male wish fulfillment figure, even if he wasn't a male power fantasy? Well, at the end of the game, it's revealed that Cronus Maelor is not exactly human. He's actually the Horde King and has been trying to seize power from King Winthrop in order for the Horde to... You know what? It's kind of unclear. It just seems like he's seizing power for power's sake. Anyway, Chauncey thwarts him by causing him to choke to death on a chicken leg. A nice bit of mirroring and irony. After which, Winthrop declares the Horde is driven from the kingdom and names Chauncey his adopted son and heir to the throne. So yeah, gotta get that happy ending in there, I guess. The Horde for the Sega Saturn is a fun, if confused, experience. It both makes fun of, but also supports, ideas surrounding capitalism, consumerism, and colonialism. And Kirk Cameron's presence is just awkward no matter how you look at it. The minute-to-minute gameplay feels like it's hampered by the game's release just at the cusp of the 3D polygon era of gaming. But the overall experience has enough charm that it manages to hold its own anyway. It has enough charm and interesting ideas that it makes for a good weekend rental.